respective communities, but because the coalitions, during this period at least, represented in the eyes of the city's established interests a much more serious threat. We can see why when we look at the first and arguably most successful iteration, the Socialist Party, which appeared in Los Angeles soon after the turn of the century and established a context for insurgent politics the city had never seen. The threat of the socialists lay not simply in their call to curtail the power of capital, but in the way they made that call. Socialists appealed to working people, and to reach those people, they went to where they congregated in the heart of the city. In the plaza in Pershing Square and the streets and alleys between and around them gathered Angelenos of all backgrounds who worked there, or who were out of work, or on their way to and from it. In the years before television and radio, street speaking was a primary form of recreation and information exchange for those of modest means. Even prior to the socialists, street orators had become prevalent enough to irritate business and property owners throughout downtown. One Third Street property owner, for example, complained to City Hall that local soapboxers, and these are his words, indulge in loud, boisterous, and obscene speech, engage in acrimonious debate with each other and with persons passing along Main Street and Third Street. The sound and disturbance created by these meetings caused great annoyance and disturbed the peace of the persons in the neighborhood. Large numbers of people congregate at these meetings and prevent the passage of traffic along Third Street, causing inconvenience to the public and causing vehicles to travel along the wrong side of the street. An attorney for business owners along 2nd and Los Angeles streets complained that the popularity of speakers and debates there ensured the continuous presence of undesirable loungers eager for a good performance or argument. If anyone leaves his automobile parked near the curb on these blocks during the daytime, he noted, it is generally a matter of but a few minutes before the running board of that automobile would be converted into a bench, upon which will be seated loiterers and all forms of unemployed humanity. What the socialists did was turn this nuisance into a threat. Religious exhortations and mentally unstable rants for one thing, but an anti-capitalist tirade whipping up scores of downtown laborers provided an ominous reminder to the business magnate venturing onto the sidewalk that he was outnumbered drastically in his own city, that these gatherings made a downtown already choked with traffic more crowded still. Nor was it only white workers on the box or in the audience. In various ways, the Socialist Party courted both African American and Mexican Angelenos, and our forlorn businessmen might have heard among the call to arms expressions of support for the leaders of the radical Mexican political organization El Partido Liberal Mexicano, with whom the local socialists forged an alliance, or perhaps the eloquent voice of the Reverend George Washington Woodbey, a black Baptist minister and career party stumper who once opined there are no foreigners and cannot be unless some person comes down from Mars or Jupiter or someplace. I stand on the declaration of Thomas Paine when he said, "The world is my country." Each of these gatherings portended in microcosm a larger mass gathering of the city's cross-cultural workforce. If they were to coalesce and to draw the throngs out of the mixed ethnic working class districts east and south of downtown, they could, in theory, bring the heart of the city to a stop. After the socialists came, street speaking became something LA's elites could no longer ignore. At first, LA's business leaders tried to counter these efforts by mounting the soapbox themselves. They called it a businessman's Christian meeting, but the Christian businessmen were out of their element and out of their league. Socialists and non-socialists alike laughed them off as fat tradesmen garbed in expensive but shapeless clothes, urging hungry men to turn their minds to better things above. When rebuttal didn't work, the capitalists resorted to force and directed the LAPD to begin arresting street speakers. But the socialists countered ingeniously. A speaker would mount a soapbox and begin to recite from the Constitution. As soon as officers arrested him, or in some cases her, another took their place. Within a short time, the city's jails were flooded and the court system overwhelmed. Unable to house or process all the prisoners, city officials brokered a truce, allowing socialists back on the street as long as they stayed out of a newly established no-speech zone along some of the busiest thoroughfares. The subsequent rise and fall of the Socialist Party has been told many times, and I'll only summarize it here. With its speaking rights restored, the party continued to grow even as its opponents scrambled to abolish the ward system of elections and thereby dilute the vote of the proletarian districts. By 1911, it seemed its time might possibly come. Party mayoral candidate Job Harriman captured a plurality in the primary and appeared within reach of the city's highest office. Days before the election, calamity struck the socialists when the two union members on trial for the bombing of the Times building rescinded their not guilty pleas and confessed to the crime. The socialists' close identification with organized labor now proved its undoing. Harriman finished a distant third in the balloting, and the party faded away to obscurity. But neither the city's business elites nor the police forgot the lessons of the socialist threat, and the LAPD in particular began to refine its tactics against political activists, expanding the no-speech zone throughout downtown and arresting any speaker or audience they deemed subversive. To discourage the mass arrest strategy of the socialists, they also began to make things much more unpleasant for the detainees. An ugly indication of what was to come occurred on Christmas Day, 1913, when police moved in on a group of Mexican, Italian, and Anglo men who had assembled at the plaza to discuss, as they put it, the employment situation. In the melee that followed, officers shot and killed one Rafael Adames, whom they later asserted was a ringleader of the group. A subsequent investigation cleared the police of any wrongdoing, but 6 months later, numerous participants in the gathering remained behind bars. This incident established the parameters of acceptable police response that would continue for the next 2 decades. The fear of a mongrel uprising embodied in the Christmas Day meeting was only exacerbated by the onset of World War I. Feeding off incidents like the Zimmerman telegram and its own paranoia, the Times printed sensationalist warnings of multiracial armies massing south of the border, where, according to one article, German nationals hobnob with Mexican bandits, Japanese agents, and renegades from this country. Los Angeles is the headquarters for this vicious system, and it is there that the deals between German and Mexican representatives are frequently made. Without the eternal visions of loyal citizenry, the paper concluded, Los Angeles would be overrun by an invading horde, aided by traitors now being recruited right under their very noses. The federal government's military intelligence office took this possibility seriously enough that they dispatched multilingual spies to Pershing Square and other downtown venues in the hopes of catching German agents in the act of recruiting other immigrants for fifth column activities. For their part, left-wing orators downtown sometimes contributed to these fears by suggesting policies to promote loyalty among non-whites at odds with the prevailing social order. One plaza speaker named Vicente Carrillo, for instance, questioned the motivations of Mexicans in joining the fight against Germany. Why, he asked, not take 500,000 Mexicans and marry them to American girls, that we may have some interest to fight for? By the standards of the time, Carrillo got off easy with a jail sentence and eventual deportation. But city officials participated enthusiastically in the national crackdown on labor activism that followed World War I and the Russian Revolution. They, in essence, drove the local chapter of the Industrial Workers of the World, another group notable for its multi-ethnic membership, underground, and intimidated other leftists into staying home. Writer Louis Adamich, writing about Los Angeles in the aftermath of this campaign, found the streets devoid of the politically charged rhetoric that had flowed so freely a few years earlier. The occasional speaker still held forth at the plaza, he allowed, but they could not broach any subject that was economic heresy. The 20s are noted as a period where national politics turned to the right, and they were on balance good years for Davis, Hines, and their cohorts. It's possible at some point in there they might have dared to believe that they had silenced any subversive threat to the city forever. But the onset of the Great Depression ended the enforced peace of Los Angeles, and the Red Squad found itself facing a new foe. The Communist Party of the United States of America had maintained a chapter in the city since the early 1920s, but it had largely kept to itself in the Jewish heart of Boyle Heights. By 1930, however, the plunging stock market was casting more and more Americans into the ranks of the unemployed. People were going hungry, facing evictions from their homes. A trickle of economic refugees from the Midwest became a flood, and the LAPD turned their attention to curb the influx of those who had not yet come to be known in popular terms as Okies. If white American citizens faced harassment and occasional expulsion from Los Angeles, residents of Mexican ancestry had it worse. The repatriation campaigns instituted by authorities across the Southwest to relieve themselves of the burden of supporting people they tended to classify, whatever their citizenship, as foreigners, exacerbated an already unstable situation in working-class districts straddling the Los Angeles River. Amid the trauma and uncertainty, communists suddenly found that their call for a workers' revolution was receiving a more enthusiastic reception. They seized on the opportunity with a vengeance, returning to the very streets that activists had largely ceded to the Red Squad. The communist strategy departed in one significant respect from that of its most well-known predecessor. The socialists had used the rhetoric of street speech to gain converts. They sought to communicate by speech. For communists, the speaking itself was less important than the inevitable drama that played out between protesters and the police. The LAPD had by now codified its zero-tolerance policy on communist gatherings. The communists, men and women, boys and girls, met them head-on. By conventional measures, the Reds got the worst of it. One party member I interviewed a few years ago recalled a demonstration she attended when she was still in high school around 1931, and these are her words. Every time somebody tried to speak on the corner, they would beat the shit out of them. We girls didn't wear pants then, we wore dresses, and they'd take their straps and smack us across the legs. We all came back with terrible welts on our legs. Anyway, that day on one corner, one of our people stood up to make a speech, and the Red Squad went after them. We came equipped. I had a hairpin and pepper. They opened his skull, and I was standing in the middle of the street, and the skull was pouring blood, and I got wild. And I took the hairpin, and I jabbed it in the cop's neck, yelling, "Let go of him." And he turned around and let me have it. He knocked me out. If scenes like this seem futile to us, though, they represented for the communists a golden opportunity. They manifested in unambiguous terms the class struggle between the workers of Los Angeles and the lackeys of the capitalists. And they drew participants eager to express their frustration at their circumstances, spectators curious about the conflict and perhaps titillated by the violence, as well as substantial numbers of anti-communists, especially from the American Legion, eager to do their part to stamp out radicalism, but who often did little more than contribute to the size of the crowd. In other words, the communists brought back in dramatic fashion the congregations that had spooked LA's elite decades earlier, and fortified by the travails of economic stagnation, they showed yet again that the political status quo was not as solid as its defenders hoped. This is a member of what was probably the Young Communist League, judging by her uniform, being taken away from by the police. Go ahead, yeah, let's just go through them. I'm sorry? I think Taylor was it was the business up there in the corner. This one I think is fairly self-explanatory. Yeah. This is the paddy wagon where they would load up people being arrested at the demonstrations. And then this final one is a gathering at the plaza on May Day in 1934. The communists won a court case a few months earlier, giving them the right to assemble at the plaza. So this gives you a sense of the crowds they could draw when they were allowed to hold a demonstration. And I'm guessing was probably the largest gathering that the local chapter ever held at Los Angeles. There's a tendency among a certain kind of historian to romanticize the communists, and I don't want to make that mistake here. A little while ago, I interviewed a man named, or visited with a man named Morris Kadish, whose older brother Reuben studied under Siqueiros in LA and went on to a successful career as a muralist and sculptor. Maury met Siqueiros one evening when Reuben invited him back to the Kadish home in Boyle Heights for dinner. He remembers a very dour man who spent a lot of time pounding the table with his fist and saying, "You've got to have conviction." Maury was not particularly impressed, and his reaction was not all that unusual among his contemporaries, many of whom found communists dull, rigid, pedantic, condescending, doctrinaire, or worse. The LA chapter did include members of many different ethnic and racial backgrounds, but many more people, like the celebrated Mexican-American activist Bert Corona, preferred to work in alliance with communists rather than join the party themselves. Even this arm's-length relationship, however, illuminates the promise, the hope, for empowerment that communists represented. And if one includes non-communist allies, then their influence extended deep into the population and working class Los Angeles. For their part, the Red Squad enjoyed the widespread support of LA's property classes. To be sure, there was the occasional glitch. After officers tear-gassed a communist gathering at Pershing Square, they received a number of complaints from guests at the Biltmore Hotel who had been smoked out of their rooms as a result. But in the aggregate, the supporters of Hines and Company remained every bit as committed to stifling the revolution as the communists were to effecting it. Siqueiros came to Los Angeles at the high point of this conflict, but before the New Deal, Upton Sinclair's End Poverty in California, the CIO and other creations of the mid-1930s deflected the battle to other arenas. I'm not sure how successfully my comments today encapsulate the political history of Los Angeles in the years leading up to his arrival. I've left a lot of things out, as anyone with only 20 minutes or half an hour would have to. But I hope what I hope they have done is show how an artist whose message, which however beautifully invoked was not in his work itself spelled out in any definitive way, could paint murals that spoke so clearly to the citizens of a city he only fleetingly encountered, and could frighten the established powers so effectively that they contrived to bar his work from public view. I have not done a lot of research on Siqueiros himself, but I find it hard to believe, given the company he kept while he was in this city, given the location of America Tropical, that he did not at least witness examples of the clashes I've discussed here, and perhaps participated in one or two. When we look at America Tropical and Street Meeting, or if and when we get the chance to look at them again, we see another kind of street speech, perhaps not auditory, but one every bit as loud as the cacophony of soapboxers and their opponents that vied for control of the streets of downtown Los Angeles, in a time when those streets represented something closer to the soul of the city than they do today. Thank you very much.
Katha Paquette is Assistant Professor of Latin American Art in the College of the Arts at California State University in Long Beach. In her research and publications, she has focused on Mexican art in the early to mid-20th century, including mural art produced by Mexican artists working in the United States. Dr. Paquette has also investigated questions at issue concerning U.S.-Mexican intercultural relations and U.S. museum reception of Latin American art. She is currently working on a book about Diego Rivera's 1933 Rockefeller Center mural. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katha Paquette.
When Siqueiros was given opportunities to paint murals in Los Angeles, one of the subjects he chose to focus on was labor. And as we'll see in the next 30 minutes, the murals he produced were intriguing in that they not only referred to the conditions in which laborers worked, but also delineated controversial solutions. Another Mexican artist in the US at the time, Diego Rivera, shared Siqueiros' concerns, but explored a different set of solutions in a remarkably different manner. In my talk, I'll frame their work in terms of period politics, and in particular, union politics. What was at stake in 1932 and 1933? Also, what did patrons and artists have to gain or lose in these mural commissions? First slide, actually. According to Siqueiros, he was invited to produce his first mural by Mrs. Nelbert Chouinard, who wanted him to demonstrate fresco techniques to students at the Chouinard School of Art. Siqueiros, however, used this commission to his own advantage. He and his team of students produced this image in July of 1932, construction workers on the rooftop and construction platform of a two-story building, a black man and a white woman below holding children, and an individual in the center speaking from a platform. Siqueiros said little at the time about the subject of the mural. In a public lecture, he said simply that it depicted a factory meeting. Period publications referred to it as workers' meeting. Perhaps because Siqueiros said so little himself about the work, other than the techniques used to produce it, which I'll talk about in a moment, art historians haven't said much about it either. But it's an intriguing work, and I will argue it was a significant one. At first glance, workers' meeting portrayed one scene, but there were actually two distinct pictorial spaces. Siqueiros used the slightly slanted line in the left side at the top to define a building's facade that projected out into the viewer's space. He brought the workers to life with strong modeling in light and shadow. He showed hands and legs wrapped over the scaffolding and bodies leaning forward, and thus made it seem as if they were coming out towards the viewer. By including the actual windows of the building in the composition, he reinforced the trompe-l'oeil effect, the impression that this was the wall of an actual building with real workers on the roof and real scaffolding. But in the lower half of the composition, he used the same line to define the surface of a wall in the background. and the floor line it intersected with made clear that the floor surface was receding into space. Although the fist of the man on the platform came up in front of the scaffolding, as if he was outdoors with the construction workers, the bottom part of the scaffold could be interpreted as a cross-section of an indoor ceiling. So this was an interior space, the dimly lit room inside a factory with a few workers and boxed product. I'd like to suggest that the bottom half of the composition differed from the top half in one other important way. The areas of light and shadow and the shapes that made up the imaginary structure that the actual door led into were inconsistent with naturalistic conventions. And while the modeling in light and shadow made the figures appear three-dimensional, the pictorial space was reminiscent of a type of painting popular in the early 1930s, figurative art with abstract overtones, cubist-like renditions of interiors. I've wondered if Siqueiros wanted the lower part of the composition to read not so much as a trompe-l'oeil like the top half, but more as a painted image. If that's the case, the construction workers above wouldn't be viewing a real public speaker. Instead, they'd be looking at the contents of a public mural. What were the contents? Siqueiros, we can easily interpret two distinct points from this bottom half. With the figure of the black worker, he addressed the issue of racism, suggesting that it was an ideology that industry thrived on. With the facial expressions of the two workers, the black man's look of quiet despair and the woman's grimace, which spoke both of anguish and sadness, he commented more generally on the desperate situations of the working class during the Depression. As I said, Siqueiros never said much himself about the subject of this work, and in doing so left it open to interpretation, perhaps to minimize the possibility of censorship in a city hostile to organized labor. But he did make attempts to otherwise fix meaning, primarily through word of mouth with acquaintances. His partner, Blanca Luz Brum, provided information in an article published in August in Mexico City. She specifically stated that the figure in the center was communist. Knowing this, and knowing that the artist himself had been a communist union organizer in the city of Guadalajara and in a mining district in Jalisco, that in 1928 he led a delegation of workers from different industries to a congress of red trade unions in Moscow, and that during the 1930s he was a supporter of the Comintern, the Stalin-dominated communist international based in Moscow. Knowing these things, one could draw certain conclusions, that this was a communist union organizer propagandizing for a split from what communists referred to as conservative unions, such as the American Federation of Labor, to a union under the control of the Communist Party. The orator, as Brum referred to him, would have been calling for a global revolution engineered by the Soviet Union. Whether or not Siqueiros meant the lower half to be an image of a painted image of a communist worker inciting revolution, the work was significant for Siqueiros as a coda that summarized his theories about art. It embodied his notion of dialectic subversive painting, politically subversive works for the working class. It made use of techniques that he believed necessary for such painting. It was a large-scale image on an exterior wall facing a city street and therefore visible to passers-by. The team that produced it worked as a collective and in the process were theoretically indoctrinated to communist thinking. It was created with industrial tools and materials such as color-tinted cement that Siqueiros assumed would better adhere to the cement wall, air guns, air compressor, and nozzles to create the soft, smoky effect that you see around the figures, and stencils to produce the hard-edged shapes. Siqueiros at the time was calling literally for a technical revolution in painting that would be appropriate for a social revolution. He believed that only modern materials and equipment could express the views of industrial workers, convert the public to the idea of a global revolution, and in his words, change the economic system of the world. Workers' meeting, in short, expressed his political aims, and it demonstrated the process through which he hoped to achieve them. What's interesting here is that Siqueiros, in a sense, and I still have to think about this, played it safe with his imagery. We know that the soapbox order tradition was common in Los Angeles in the early 30s. But how serious was it to depict a soapbox orator, a street speaker? In this mural, other than the red shirt of the speaker, there were no obvious markers of Marxist ideology, no evidence of, no specific symbols of Communist Party affiliation or even union affiliation. It was perhaps a little bit suitable for Depression-era politics and for a town whose industries were committed to the open shop and didn't tolerate communists. But the next work that Siqueiros created was not so ambiguous. And many historians have said that this work, Tropical America, was the most ambitious of the three works he produced in LA in terms of imagery. It certainly was the most dramatic. It makes, first, a dramatic comment on the so-called vogue of things Mexican in the US at the time. And I thought I'd show